The lake had always been the crown jewel of Clearwater Ridge, a shimmering stretch of blue surrounded by whispering pines and the quiet hum of expensive boats. For years, the Homeowners Association had treated it as their private paradise, a playground for board members and select residents who believed the world revolved around their gated rules. They hosted exclusive barbecues on the docks, banned outsiders from fishing, and even fined residents who didn't use the approved HOA-branded kayaks. To them, the lake wasn't just water, it was status, but the truth was buried deeper than anyone realized. The lake, known legally as Clearwater Reserve, had never been part of the HOA's official property. Decades ago, it was designated as a separate parcel, privately owned by the descendants of the original ranching family that once lived in the area. Over time, paperwork was lost, maps were redrawn, and the HOA simply assumed ownership. They installed fences, patrol signs, and guards, treating it as their own without ever checking the records. That was where Mason Reed came in. Mason was no stranger to land deals. A quiet investor in rural properties and forgotten tracts, he had built a career on understanding what others overlooked. His approach was simple: find the mistakes hidden in the fine print. When he stumbled across Clearwater Reserve's title documents buried in a county archive, he realized the lake wasn't owned by the HOA at all. The previous title holder, an elderly widow named Ethel Hargrove, had passed away with no heirs, and the land had quietly reverted to public auction under state oversight. Mason attended the auction quietly, surrounded by disinterested bidders who saw the parcel as just a lake. But Mason saw leverage, power wrapped in tranquility. For a fraction of the HOA's annual budget, he bought Clearwater Reserve outright. When the county clerk handed him the deed, stamped and sealed, Mason understood what that paper meant. Every boat, every dock, every drop of water the HOA claimed was now his. For the first few weeks, he kept his ownership discreet. He wanted to learn how the HOA operated before revealing the truth. Mason drove to Clearwater Ridge under the guise of a prospective resident, taking notes on their restrictions, their fees, and their smug sense of control. He saw how board members barked orders at landscapers, how they fined families for leaving garden hoses out, and how they bragged about their private lake to newcomers. It was arrogance built on ignorance. By the time Mason had his surveyors map the boundaries of Clearwater Reserve, the reality was undeniable. The lake's property line extended 30 feet inland from the shore, covering every pier, boat slip, and access path the HOA used. Every single point of entry to the water sat squarely on Mason's land. It was only then that Mason made his move. He had his attorney draft a formal notice of ownership and sent copies to the HOA board. The letter was polite but firm, explaining that as the lawful owner of Clearwater Reserve, Mason was reviewing the current use of the property and expected the HOA to cease all unauthorized activities on the land until agreements could be made. It wasn't a threat, just a factual statement backed by law. The response came within hours, and it was predictably hostile. The HOA president, a sharp-tongued woman named Linda Prescott, dismissed the claim entirely. In her email, she accused Mason of fraud and trespassing, insisting that the HOA had owned and maintained the lake for over 20 years. She even attached scanned copies of their bylaws as if internal rules could override a recorded deed. Then, without hesitation, she called the county sheriff's office to report an incident of attempted land theft. When the deputy arrived at Mason's property line the next morning, Mason was calm, almost amused. He handed the officer his paperwork, the deed, the county auction record, and the notarized survey map. The deputy read everything carefully, nodded, and left without another word. The HOA's power play had failed before it began. That night, Mason watched from a distance as the HOA board gathered at the clubhouse. Flashlights flickered near the docks and angry voices echoed over the water. He could almost feel their panic. For the first time, they realized that something they had taken for granted, their access, their privilege, might no longer belong to them. The following day, Mason posted new signs around the lake perimeter. Each one read, "Private property, Access by written permission only. They weren't confrontational, just clear. Within hours, HOA members began to panic. Text chains lit up, meetings were called, and accusations flew across the community forum. Residents demanded answers from the board, and Linda had none. As the tension built, Mason's phone rang. It was his attorney, confirming that the HOA had filed a formal complaint with the county clerk's office, challenging his ownership. But the clerk had already verified his deed as legitimate. The HOA had no legal standing, not even a recorded easement. The case wouldn't just collapse. It would expose how carelessly the HOA had operated for decades. Meanwhile, the residents began to notice cracks in their leadership's confidence. The once untouchable board members now looked uneasy at meetings. Rumors spread that the HOA's budget was in shambles, that they'd spent community funds maintaining a lake they didn't even own. And when local news outlets picked up the story of a private investor reclaiming land from an HOA, the entire town began to watch. Mason didn't celebrate. He simply waited. He knew the HOA would lash out again, and he was ready for it. The real fight hadn't started yet. This was just the warning shot. Late one evening, as the sun dipped below the pine trees, Mason walked the shoreline of his lake, now fully his in every sense. The air was calm, but beneath that peace he sensed a storm brewing. The HOA wouldn't surrender easily. They thrived on control, and losing their water meant losing their power. The reflection of the fading daylight shimmered across the still surface of Clearwater Reserve. Mason smiled faintly. What they didn't understand yet was that this wasn't just a property dispute. It was about to become a reckoning. By the time dawn broke over Clearwater Ridge, the HOA board had already convened an emergency meeting inside the glass-walled clubhouse that overlooked the lake. The air inside was thick with tension and disbelief. For years, they had ruled this community like monarchs, dictating every color of paint, every mailbox design, every shrub allowed to grow past a certain height. But now their authority had been challenged, not by a resident, but by an outsider who had upended their illusion of ownership with a single piece of paper. Within hours of Mason's ownership notice, the board began to mobilize. Linda Prescott, the HOA president, spearheaded a campaign of defiance. She rallied her loyal members, flooding the community with flyers claiming the lake thief was attempting to extort residents and steal their shared amenities. Her tone was fierce, her words dripping with indignation. In her mind, if she could convince enough people that Mason was the villain, the legal truth wouldn't matter. Public opinion would. And for a while, it seemed to work. Residents who had never cared about property boundaries suddenly became foot soldiers in Linda's crusade. They began gathering at the lakeside, shouting at anyone who came near the new property signs Mason had installed. They ripped some down in protest. Others stood guard on the docks with arms crossed, as if guarding their kingdom from invasion. The HOA had turned a legal misunderstanding into a full-blown community rebellion. Mason, however, remained unshaken. He knew this pattern all too well, the fury that erupts when entitlement is challenged. He had seen it before, in smaller towns and with smaller egos. But Clearwater Ridge was different. Here, money and reputation intertwined like vines around a crumbling wall. The HOA board wasn't just defending land. They were defending their pride, their illusion of control. And pride, Mason knew, could drive people to do reckless things. A few days later, he received a notice from the county zoning office. The HOA had filed a complaint alleging illegal signage, claiming his private property posts violated community standards and obstructed public enjoyment. Mason forwarded the letter to his attorney, who responded with certified documentation of the property's true ownership. The complaint was dismissed in less than 48 hours. The HOA's second strike had failed, but it didn't stop them. Next came the sheriff's patrol car. One morning, Mason woke to see two deputies idling near the gravel path leading to the lake. The HOA had called again, this time claiming suspicious activity, that someone was interfering with community property. When the officers approached, Mason calmly presented his deed and property survey again. One of the deputies recognized him from the previous incident and simply shook his head. Same paperwork, same outcome, Mason thought silently. The deputies left without taking action, and the HOA's attempt to intimidate him backfired yet again. But Linda wasn't finished. If law and intimidation failed, she would turn to manipulation. The HOA began issuing letters to residents, warning them not to trespass on disputed land. They framed the situation as if Mason were trying to take something from them, when in truth he was simply protecting what was his. Soon, whispers spread through Clearwater Ridge that Mason planned to drain the lake or build condos or charge for access. Fear and rumor became the HOA's weapon of choice. Meanwhile, Mason began gathering his own ammunition, not in the form of threats, but information. He dug through county records, HOA filings, maintenance budgets, and meeting minutes. What he uncovered was startling. For years, the HOA had collected lake maintenance fees from residents, thousands of dollars annually, even though the property legally wasn't theirs. That money had been spent on private events, landscaping for board members' homes, and even personal travel expenses disguised as maintenance oversight. It wasn't just arrogance anymore. It was fraud. Mason quietly assembled the documents into a single comprehensive report. His attorney reviewed every page, confirming what Mason suspected. The HOA had been misappropriating funds for years under false pretenses. If this ever reached court, they would face not only restitution but potential criminal charges, but Mason wasn't ready to reveal his hand just yet. He wanted the HOA to dig its own grave first, so he waited, and the board kept digging. In a desperate bid to assert control, Linda ordered the HOA maintenance crew to restore the lake area by tearing down Mason's signs again and repainting the docks. But this time, Mason had cameras watching. Hidden trail cams captured every moment, the trespassing, the vandalism, the clear violation of private property laws. Mason downloaded the footage, time-stamped and verified it, and quietly handed a copy to the county sheriff's office. Within days, Linda and the board received formal trespass warnings, official notices carrying legal weight. The community's tone began to shift. Residents who had initially rallied behind the HOA now saw the reality of their leader's recklessness. The once united front fractured. Neighbors whispered that Linda had gone too far. Some even approached Mason privately, apologizing for their earlier hostility and asking what he planned to do next. Mason, however, didn't speak publicly. He knew silence was more powerful than any defense. Every action, every calm refusal to be provoked only made the HOA appear more unhinged. He became the still center of their storm, the quiet owner whose patience only deepened their panic. Then came the turning point. A week after the trespass warnings were issued, the HOA attempted one last act of defiance. They organized a lake day, an event meant to show residents that the lake still belonged to the community. Flyers promised food, music, and boating, daring Mason to intervene. Dozens gathered at the docks that Saturday, laughing loudly, trying to recapture their former dominance. But the laughter stopped the moment 2 county sheriff vehicles pulled up. The deputies didn't speak much. They simply handed Linda a citation for violating a cease and desist order regarding unauthorized use of private land. Mason's footage had done its job. The crowd fell silent, and within minutes, the lake day ended before it began. Families packed their coolers and hurried away, leaving the board red-faced and furious. That night, as Mason stood on his porch overlooking the calm water, he felt the tide finally turning. The HOA's bluster was losing strength. They had played every card they had, intimidation, deception, manipulation, and each had failed. But he also knew that desperate people often make desperate moves. In the distance, he could see the clubhouse lights still on, glowing weakly across the water. The board wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Linda Prescott wasn't the type to surrender. She would try something else, something bigger, something reckless. And Mason was ready for it, because what she didn't know was that her downfall was already in motion, buried in those financial records, waiting for the perfect moment to surface. The aftermath of the failed lake day sent ripples of unease through Clearwater Ridge. What had once been a pristine, perfectly controlled community now simmered with quiet chaos. The board's confident facade was cracking, and beneath it, desperation was beginning to show. Residents who had once worshipped the HOA's authority were now whispering doubts over their backyard fences, wondering how a simple land ownership issue had turned into a full-scale legal disaster. Linda Prescott and her board met behind closed doors almost every evening after that. The clubhouse lights stayed on late, glowing over the still surface of the lake that was no longer theirs to command. The meetings were filled with panic and blame, treasurer reports that didn't balance, records that couldn't be found, and questions that no one dared to answer out loud. For years, the HOA had operated like an untouchable empire, unquestioned and unchecked. But Mason's quiet ownership had pulled the first thread, and now the entire fabric was unraveling. Mason, meanwhile, remained methodical. He had learned long ago that the best revenge wasn't loud, it was thorough. The report he had compiled on the HOA's finances was now nearly complete. Page after page documented years of misuse, landscaping contracts given to relatives, maintenance funds used for luxury vacations, and a pattern of fake invoices funneled through shell contractors. The evidence was irrefutable, but Mason didn't rush to expose it. He wanted the board to make one more mistake, something undeniable that would force the county to act. He didn't have to wait long. 2 weeks after the HOA's public humiliation, a new letter arrived in Mason's mailbox. It bore the official HOA letterhead in an almost comically bold tone. The board was attempting to impose a community assessment fee on all residents, including Mason, to cover legal expenses incurred due to ongoing disputes regarding the lake. The amount was absurd, $2,500 per household. The HOA's plan was simple: shift their legal debts onto the homeowners, framing it as a collective defense fund. They even claimed that Mason was responsible for the financial strain, labeling him the aggressor. What they didn't realize was that by issuing that fee, they had just committed another violation, one that would expose everything. Within days, residents began to revolt. Families who had already grown tired of Linda's leadership now had concrete reasons to resist. Social media threads erupted with outrage. Screenshots of the assessment letter circulated online, and local news outlets caught wind of the controversy. Reporters began showing up at Clearwater Ridge's gates, asking uncomfortable questions. Cameras panned across the private property signs still standing around the lake, Mason's silent testimony to the HOA's arrogance. Mason didn't speak to reporters. He didn't need to. The truth was already speaking for him. Behind the scenes, the treasurer of the HOA, a nervous man named Greg Hall, finally broke. Overwhelmed by guilt and fear, he quietly reached out to the county auditor's office and disclosed internal records. His statement confirmed everything Mason had uncovered. The HOA's board had been falsifying expenditures for years, masking personal luxuries as community upkeep. The audit team quickly launched an investigation, and subpoenas began to arrive at the homes of board members. The once proud rulers of Clearwater Ridge were now scrambling to protect themselves. Linda tried to rally her allies again, framing the investigation as government overreach. But her credibility was collapsing fast. Even her most loyal followers began to distance themselves. The HOA's funds were frozen pending the audit, leaving them unable to pay their contractors, legal fees, or even the electric bill for the clubhouse. What was once the center of community prestige became a dark, empty building with locked doors and unpaid notices taped to the windows. Meanwhile, Mason continued to move with precision. He contacted a civil attorney to draft a formal cease and desist order against any further HOA interference with his property. The order demanded that all docks, boats, and structures encroaching on Clearwater Reserve be removed within 30 days. When residents learned this, panic spread again. But this time, their anger wasn't directed at Mason. It was aimed squarely at the HOA that had led them into this disaster. By the time the audit results were released, the situation had spiraled beyond repair. The report confirmed tens of thousands of dollars in unaccounted transactions, several of which were traced directly to Linda's personal accounts. The findings were damning. Not just administrative mistakes, but deliberate misuse of community funds. The county prosecutor announced that a criminal review was underway. Linda's arrogance had crossed the line into potential fraud. The news broke like wildfire. Television trucks lined the streets. Journalists interviewed angry residents who felt betrayed and lied to. Overnight, Clearwater Ridge transformed from a picture-perfect neighborhood into a public scandal. Home values plummeted, buyers backed out of contracts, and the HOA's name became synonymous with corruption. Through it all, Mason remained unseen but omnipresent. The man the HOA had tried to paint as an outsider, a threat, now looked like the only person in the story who had done everything by the book. His calmness infuriated Linda more than anything else. She began sending him letters filled with veiled threats, accusing him of ruining her life. Mason's attorney kept them all, documenting every word. The sheriff's office soon arrived at Linda's door with a warrant for record seizure. Her once loyal board members scattered, resigning one by one, leaving her isolated and desperate. The HOA's bank accounts were frozen indefinitely, and the community's operations ground to a halt. For the first time in decades, Clearwater Ridge had no functioning leadership, and still, Mason didn't celebrate. He wasn't driven by vengeance for its own sake. What mattered to him was principle, that people who abused power and manipulated others finally faced accountability. The lake, silent and steady as ever, reflected the twilight sky like glass as he watched from his porch. It had seen the rise and fall of arrogance before. It would see it again. Yet Mason knew something else too. A storm wasn't truly over until the air was cleared completely. And while the HOA was collapsing, Linda Prescott wasn't done fighting. Her pride wouldn't allow surrender. Somewhere in that crumbling clubhouse, she was plotting her next move, desperate to salvage what little control she still believed she had. As the autumn wind swept across the water, Mason could almost feel it, the tension, the resentment, the approaching chaos. The HOA's legal downfall was just beginning. But what came next would be far more personal. Because for Linda, it was no longer about the lake, it was about revenge. The fallout from the audit had devastated Clearwater Ridge. The community that once prided itself on perfection was now fractured beyond recognition. The clubhouse, once a symbol of order and elegance, sat dark and locked, its windows reflecting the silent waters of the lake that had started it all. The manicured lawns were unkept, the flower beds overgrown, and the once pristine walking trails were littered with fallen leaves no one bothered to clear. It was as though the entire neighborhood had given up. But one person hadn't: Linda Prescott. Her world had crumbled overnight. The audit had not only stripped her of power, but had placed her under investigation. Her name was splashed across local headlines. HOA president accused of fraud and misuse of funds. Her reputation, her influence, even her carefully curated image as the Queen of Clearwater Ridge had disintegrated. The residents who once followed her now avoided eye contact at the grocery store. The people she'd commanded now whispered her name in pity or disgust. And in her mind, there was only one person to blame: Mason Reed. Linda's anger simmered into obsession. She spent sleepless nights scrolling through old emails, HOA documents, and community messages, convinced that Mason had orchestrated everything. The more she thought about it, the more she twisted the story in her head. He hadn't just bought the lake, he had stolen it. He hadn't just exposed her mismanagement, he had destroyed her life. The narrative comforted her wounded pride. It was easier to hate Mason than to face the truth. So she decided to retaliate. Her first move was subtle, almost invisible. Late one night, she emailed a small group of remaining HOA loyalists, people who still believed she had been treated unfairly. She framed Mason as a predatory developer, planning to privatize the lake, drain it, and sell access rights to outsiders. The email spread like wildfire through the neighborhood's private chat groups. Fear crept back into the community, and resentment followed. By the next morning, residents were once again muttering about Mason, the man who ruined their lake. Mason knew something was stirring. Anonymous letters began appearing in his mailbox, accusations, insults, and threats written in shaky handwriting. Someone slashed the tires of his truck one night. Another time he found a dead fish nailed to his dock post. It was childish, but it was also a warning. He understood exactly where it came from. This wasn't random anger, this was Linda's hand at work. Still, Mason refused to react emotionally. Instead, he documented everything. Every note, every photo, every incident was logged, dated, and stored. He knew how these games were played. Anger was what his opponents wanted, but patience was what destroyed them. He simply called the sheriff, filed quiet reports, and waited. Linda, however, mistook his silence for weakness. When the subtle intimidation failed, she grew bolder. Late one weekend, she trespassed onto Mason's property with two of her remaining allies. Under cover of darkness, they spray-painted thief and liar across one of his boathouses. They ripped down his signs again and dumped garbage into the water. What they didn't realize was that Mason's cameras, hidden strategically around the shoreline, caught everything in high definition. By morning, Mason had the footage copied and sent directly to the sheriff's office and his attorney. Trespassing, vandalism, harassment. Within 48 hours, deputies arrived at Linda's home with a criminal summons. The same woman who had once summoned law enforcement to intimidate others now stood red-faced and trembling as officers served her with papers. The neighborhood watched in silence. The queen of the HOA was now a defendant in her own community. The story spread faster than wildfire. News outlets revisited the scandal with renewed interest, this time focusing on the harassment charges. Neighbors who had once defended Linda now cut her off entirely, fearful of association. The few who had joined her in her midnight stunt faced their own legal consequences. Clearwater Ridge was no longer a community. It was a battlefield divided between shame and silence. But even that didn't stop her. The next phase of Linda's retaliation was reckless, almost desperate. She began contacting local environmental agencies, claiming Mason was polluting the lake and endangering wildlife. She sent them edited photos, manipulating images to show oil-like slicks on the water's surface. Mason was notified of the complaints, and investigators briefly arrived to inspect the site. They found nothing. The lake was pristine. When Mason provided drone footage showing Linda herself dumping paint into the water days before, the investigators realized what had happened. Another report was filed. Another charge added to her growing list of offenses. At that point, Linda's grip on reality began to fray. She stopped showing up to the community meetings she once ruled. Her home became a fortress, blinds drawn, security lights flickering through the night. Her property, once immaculate, fell into disarray. And all the while, Mason remained quiet. He wasn't driven by revenge anymore. It had evolved into something deeper, a moral obligation to see justice through. What Linda had done wasn't just personal. It was a warning of what happens when unchecked authority believes itself above the law. Weeks passed, and the legal system finally began to catch up. The prosecutor handling the HOA fraud case combined the new vandalism and environmental tampering charges into a single ongoing investigation. What had started as a civil issue was now criminal. Linda's attorney urged her to settle, to admit wrongdoing, but she refused. Pride blinded her to the inevitable. Then, one cold morning, a moving truck appeared outside her home. Word spread quickly. Linda Prescott was leaving Clearwater Ridge. Her resignation letter was short and bitter, blaming corruption in the legal system and a vindictive outsider for her downfall. By afternoon, she was gone. Her once lavish home stood empty, its blinds drawn forever. But the story didn't end there. The HOA she left behind was in shambles. Without leadership, the community fractured into small groups trying to piece things back together. New residents formed an interim committee to review finances and dissolve outdated policies. Among the first motions passed was one that would forever change. Clearwater Ridge, the removal of all HOA control over the lake and its adjoining land. Mason was invited to attend the meeting where the vote was finalized. He didn't gloat or remind them of the past. He simply stood at the back of the room as the motion passed unanimously. For the first time, Clearwater Ridge residents realized the irony. The man they had feared was the one who had restored their freedom. As he left the clubhouse that evening, Mason glanced across the lake. The water shimmered beneath the moonlight, peaceful once more. The war was nearly over, but one thing still lingered: the legal remnants of Linda's misdeeds. There were whispers she was preparing to file a civil countersuit from outside the community, claiming emotional distress and loss of property value. Mason didn't mind. If she wanted a courtroom battle, he'd give her one. Because this time, everything was documented. Every lie, every act of vandalism, every fraudulent expense. She had built her own trap, and he had simply let her walk into it. The stage was set for the final confrontation, not on the water, but in the court, and Mason was ready. By the time the case reached court, Clearwater Ridge had become a symbol, not of luxury, but of how power corrodes when it goes unchecked. The county courthouse, usually quiet, was packed with curious locals, former residents, and a handful of reporters eager to witness the final act of a story that had consumed the town. On one side sat Mason Reed, calm and composed as ever, with a small stack of neatly organized documents in front of him. On the other, a visibly weary and disheveled Linda Prescott, her eyes hard, her posture rigid, her pride fighting a battle her logic had already lost. The trial was a culmination of years of arrogance and months of unraveling control. Linda's countersuit, filed under claims of emotional distress and defamation, was meant to paint herself as a victim of Mason's alleged corporate manipulation. But what began as a confident performance quickly collapsed under the weight of evidence. Mason's attorneys had come prepared, not just with deeds and maps, but with months of documentation, videos, and financial records that told a story the jury couldn't ignore. The proceedings stretched on for days. The courtroom air was thick with quiet tension as witnesses testified, county officials confirming Mason's legal purchase of the Lake Reserve, deputies recounting the repeated false reports made by the HOA, and forensic accountants unveiling the labyrinth of fraudulent spending that had funded Linda's so-called leadership. Each revelation chipped away at the facade she had built for years. The once commanding HOA president was now exposed as reckless, deceitful, and manipulative. Her voice trembled when confronted with emails written in her own hand, ordering board members to make life difficult for Mason. The trail cams, the vandalism, the paint dumped into the water, all of it came out in perfect, chronological order. There was no shouting, no chaos, just the cold, steady march of truth closing in. Mason didn't need to say much. His composure spoke volumes. His quiet presence contrasted sharply with Linda's visible unraveling. He represented order, she, desperation. And that contrast painted the story more vividly than any argument could. Outside the courtroom, Clearwater Ridge had transformed. Without Linda's grip, residents were beginning to heal. The interim committee dissolved the HOA's strictest rules and voted to release maintenance control of the lake entirely to Mason, formalizing what was already fact. The lake would remain open to residents under a fair use agreement. No fines, no unnecessary restrictions, and no arrogance. The place that once represented division had become a symbol of cooperation. But Linda's trial was the final wound that needed closing. Inside, as the final week of proceedings came to an end, Linda's attorney made one last attempt to sway the jury, a desperate speech about how she had only acted to preserve community order. But even as he spoke, it was clear the jury had already decided. The evidence was overwhelming. The HOA's misuse of funds, the harassment campaigns, and the falsified environmental reports left no room for ambiguity. When the verdict was finally read, the courtroom was silent. The jury found in favor of Mason Reed on all counts. His ownership of Clearwater Reserve was confirmed as lawful and unchallenged. Linda's countersuit was dismissed with prejudice, meaning she could never file again on the same claims. And in a stunning blow, the judge ordered restitution. The HOA's remaining funds and Linda's personal assets would go toward compensating Mason for damages, legal costs, and property restoration. For Mason, it wasn't about the money. It was about principle, the confirmation that truth, even when buried under layers of deceit, still holds power. For Linda, it was humiliation beyond measure. She sat motionless as the ruling echoed through the courtroom, her pride finally broken. The woman who once controlled hundreds of lives through fear and intimidation now faced financial ruin and public disgrace. After the verdict, reporters surrounded Mason outside the courthouse steps. Flashbulbs lit the autumn air, and questions flew from every direction. How does it feel to win? What's next for Clearwater Ridge? Mason didn't deliver a speech or grand statement. He simply said that he hoped the community could learn the value of honesty over control, and walked away. His calmness, once mocked as arrogance, was now seen as quiet integrity. Linda, on the other hand, slipped out the back door unnoticed. She moved like a shadow through the crowd, head down, avoiding cameras. The empire she had built on rules, fines, and fear was gone. Her name would forever be tied to the scandal that destroyed Clearwater Ridge's reputation. Even her allies, those few who once stood beside her, refused to speak her name now. Weeks later, when the judge's restitution order was finalized, a portion of the HOA's seized funds went directly into a community trust overseen by Mason's legal team. It was used to repair damaged docks, replant the eroded shoreline, and restore the lake's ecosystem. The irony was poetic. The same lake Linda had tried to control now thrived because of the man she had tried to destroy. As winter rolled in, Mason often walked the perimeter of Clearwater Reserve at dusk. The world had quieted again. The HOA's signs were gone, replaced by simple wooden markers designating the area as a protected property under his stewardship. The sound of water lapping against the rocks was steady, peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos that had surrounded it months earlier. But the scars remained. The community had learned a harsh lesson about power and greed, about how easily pride can twist something meant to unite into something that divides. And Mason had learned something too, that sometimes justice takes patience, and the most powerful revenge is not loud or vengeful, but lawful and precise. In time, the local news stopped covering Clearwater Ridge. New scandals took their place and the world moved on. Yet, in that quiet lakeside town, a new kind of peace had taken hold, one that no rule book or board meeting could enforce. It was earned, not imposed. As for Linda Prescott, she disappeared from public view entirely. Her home was sold at auction, her bank accounts emptied by restitution orders. Rumors surfaced of her moving to another state, living quietly under a different name, still bitter, still unrepentant. But Mason didn't care. Her power was gone, and the lake, his lake, was finally free of her shadow. The courtroom victory wasn't just a win for him. It was a cleansing for everyone who had lived under her thumb. It marked the end of the HOA's tyranny and the rebirth of the community she had once ruled. Clearwater Ridge would never be the same again. And that was exactly the point. As Mason stood at the edge of the lake one last time that season, the sunset reflected off the calm surface like molten gold. The fight was over. Justice had spoken. But deep down, he knew one final chapter remained, not in court or in headlines, but in what came after, rebuilding trust, restoring freedom, and ensuring that Clearwater Ridge would never forget the price of arrogance. Months passed since the courtroom battle ended, and Clearwater Ridge had begun to heal, not just in its physical landscape, but in its soul. The chaos, the fear, the constant noise of conflict had faded into something unfamiliar yet comforting. Silence. It was the kind of quiet that comes when truth has finally done its work, when justice leaves behind both peace and reflection. Mason Reed stood at the northern ridge overlooking the water, one crisp morning in early spring. The lake shimmered in the rising sun, untouched and clear again after years of neglect. The wind carried the soft rustle of pines and the faint hum of boats from the far shore, not motorboats or party pontoons like before, but simple rowboats, fishermen, families just rediscovering what it meant to enjoy the place without fear of fines or judgment. He thought back to when he first bought the lake reserve. How naive he'd been to think it would be a quiet escape, a sanctuary. Instead, he had walked into a storm of arrogance, control, and deceit. The HOA had treated him like an intruder, like someone who didn't belong, simply because his ownership disrupted their illusion of power. But now that illusion had dissolved, replaced by something real. Ownership built on integrity, community built on trust. The HOA no longer existed. After Linda Prescott's downfall, the state dissolved the organization entirely. What remained of its funds had been distributed as part of the restitution order, and the legal shell that once allowed the tyranny of rules over reason was gone for good. The neighborhood was self-managed now, small committees for maintenance, voluntary meetings for community projects, all operating on transparency and consent rather than authority. For the first time in years, people waved when Mason drove through the gates. There was no tension in their eyes, no resentment in their posture. They had seen the truth unfold publicly, and even those who once sided with Linda had quietly admitted in one way or another that they'd been wrong. A few even approached him at town gatherings to apologize, to thank him for standing firm when everyone else had given in. Mason never gloated. He simply smiled and said that it was all in the past, because in his heart it was. Still, some remnants of the old Clearwater Ridge lingered, the empty lots where HOA board members had fled after bankruptcy, the office building that now stood shuttered and abandoned, its letters faded and its windows coated with dust. Mason would pass it sometimes and think of everything that had happened there. The secret meetings, the harassment campaigns, the votes that were never fair. It stood now as a ghost of arrogance, a cautionary relic. But something else took its place, something better. Mason had invested part of his restitution into a new community space, the Clearwater Learning Center, built on the very land where the HOA office once stood. It wasn't about profit or ownership. It was about giving back. The center hosted weekend workshops on environmental conservation, local history, and property rights. It became a gathering place for residents to connect, to share ideas without fear of politics or power. Ironically, Mason's greatest revenge had turned out to be compassion. By creating something meaningful where Linda's greed once ruled, he ensured that her legacy would never define. Clearwater Ridge again, he often reflected on how fragile freedom really was, how easily a group of people could surrender it to a handful of bullies in the name of order. The HOA had been a perfect example of that illusion. People willingly signing away their rights because someone promised them a prettier neighborhood or a higher property value. But in truth, what they lost was priceless. The right to simply live without fear. Mason had seen that truth up close. He had lived it. And now, as the owner of the lake that once sparked a war, he intended to make sure no one else forgot it. A year after the trial, the lake became a local landmark, officially designated as the Clearwater Reserve, a protected waterway open to the public under Mason's stewardship. A wooden sign stood at the entrance, carved simply with the words, "This land belongs to those who respect it." Tourists began to visit, drawn not just by the beauty of the place, but by the story behind it, the tale of one man who stood against an entire system and won. Local journalists wrote retrospectives calling it the Battle for Clearwater Ridge. A few documentaries followed. Mason never sought the spotlight, but he understood the value of letting the truth be told. Every time someone asked for an interview, he told them the same thing. It wasn't about power. It was about doing what's right. Years later, Clearwater Ridge became a model for other communities struggling with overreaching HOAs. County officials cited the case when drafting new homeowner protection laws. Lawyers taught it in seminars as an example of private ownership rights done responsibly. Even students studying environmental management learned from Mason's balance between conservation and community use. As time passed, people forgot the names involved, except for one. Linda Prescott's name became a cautionary whisper, a symbol of what happens when power is misused. Some said she had moved to a quiet coastal town under a new name, but those who remembered her never forgot what she represented. For Mason, she was just a shadow in a long-closed chapter. The real story wasn't about her downfall, it was about what came after. One summer evening, Mason walked along the lake's shoreline, now lined with native plants and restored docks. The air was warm, filled with laughter from a nearby family barbecue. He smiled as he passed by, unnoticed except for a child who waved as he ran down the dock. Mason waved back, his heart at peace. He stopped at a small bench overlooking the water, the very spot where he had once stood and faced off against HOA board members years ago. The memory flickered for a moment, then faded, replaced by something gentler. Gratitude. Gratitude for the battle, for the lessons, for the people who finally saw the truth. The sun began to set, painting the lake gold again, just like the evening after the trial. Mason closed his eyes and listened, to the water, to the wind, to the distant sound of freedom that now belonged to everyone who lived here. He realized then that the story of Clearwater Ridge wasn't about revenge or victory. It was about resilience, the idea that no matter how strong greed becomes, integrity, when held long enough, always finds a way to win. As the light dimmed and the first stars appeared above the lake, Mason stood and took one last look across the water. His work here was done. The lake no longer needed a guardian. It had become a living symbol of what happens when courage meets truth. He walked back toward his truck, the gravel crunching softly beneath his boots. The air was calm, and the world felt right again. The battle for Clearwater Ridge had ended long ago, but the legacy of the lake would live on forever, and that was the story of HOA called cops about the lake reserve I bought. Learned I own all their water access, from start to finish. Mason Reed's journey wasn't just about property or power, it was about standing firm against arrogance, fighting back with truth and proving that justice, though slow, never truly fails. What began as a simple purchase turned into a war for freedom, a battle that exposed greed, lies, and corruption hidden beneath the glossy surface of a homeowners association. But in the end, Mason didn't just win. He rebuilt. He turned conflict into community, revenge into reform, and left behind a legacy that would outlive every lie told against him. The lake, once a weapon of control, became a symbol of peace. So, if you ever find yourself facing unfairness, manipulation, or someone trying to take what's rightfully yours, remember Mason's story. Stay calm, gather your proof, and let the truth do the talking. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more real-life inspired HOA, Karen, and property revenge stories.